When I was a kid, we would be sometimes on family holidays, and one of my dad's favourite activities, wherever we went, wherever we were, was to drag us into any church that he passed. Any old historic church building, he would always want to go and have a look inside. Even though they all look the same, he would always drag us in, and I would sort of follow behind, sulking. Because as far as I was concerned, there was nothing there for me. The buildings are old, they're cold, they're dark, they're boring, and they smell funny. I sometimes have a similar experience today when a family shopping trip to Milton Keynes, my daughters want to go into Primark. And I sort of look at it, and as far as I'm concerned, it's just a giant cube of tat. And so I say, I'm going to stay outside because there's nothing there for me. There's nothing there for me. And then sometimes we'll wander past a jewellery shop, maybe Pandora, and my wife might want to go in there, and I'll say, no, we're not going in there. There's nothing there for you. So on Monday morning, I sit down at this passage and I start reading it through, and I think, I'm not sure there's much here for us. Certainly not obvious, is it? I don't know if you feel a little bit like me. You come to these historical passages and you think, well, I just don't know what's here. I don't know what we're meant to take from this. And then I reminded myself of the passage where Paul says in Romans 15 and verse 4, Paul says, by the inspiration of the Spirit, everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through the endurance taught in the Scriptures and the encouragement they provide, we might have hope. So Paul reminds us that actually, as we look at these ancient writings that may look unpromising, Paul says, inspired by God, no, this is God's word. There is stuff in here. We may have to work harder and look a little more closely, but there is stuff in here to encourage us, to help us endure as God's people. So I want to invite you to come and do that with me this morning. If you've got 2 Samuel chapter 1 open in front of you, it may help if you've got a Bible to have that as well. We're going to have to do a little bit of context work just to understand what's here. And we're going to be in the first half of 2 Samuel over the summer months. We'll take a break as we get toward kind of autumn, and then we'll come back and do the second half of 2 Samuel in the first quarter of 2025. But as we begin in 2 Samuel, we start with this. We start with a desperate situation. Have a little look down just at the very first verse. After the death of Saul, God's anointed king, David returned from striking down the Amalekites and stayed in Ziklag 2 days. Now, what is happening? What's the context? What's the situation that we find here? What has led to the death of Saul? Well, we learned, if you're able to go back maybe this week and read some of the last chapters of 1 Samuel, we'll find that Israel are at war with the Philistines. And as the battle has heated up, has reached its kind of climax, we see that actually the Philistines are winning. They overrun Israel, and in 1 Samuel 31, we see that Saul dies. We see that his sons, 3 of his sons, are dead on the battlefield. We see many of the army have fallen. Many others have fled, and the Philistines have actually come and occupied the towns all along the Jordan Valley. It's a desperate situation for God's people in Israel. Meanwhile, what's happened to David? Well, David has been on the run from Saul. Saul has been trying to take his life, so he's legged it. And at one point, it joined up with the Philistines just to kind of stay safe. But when battle came, the Philistines said, look, we can't trust you. Away you go. David returned to the place he's staying in Ziklag, and he finds that some Amalekite raiders have come in. They've burned Ziklag to the ground, and they've captured all of the women and the children. And so David set off in hot pursuit. He manages to overcome the Amalekites and bring the women and children back. But now he's in Ziklag, sitting among the rubble, sitting among the burned down ruins. And of course, not actually knowing what has happened to Saul yet. At this point, he's sat there and he's wondering. And he's waiting. And he's worrying about news. What has become of Israel as they stood against the Philistines? Now, we've got to ask the question, haven't we? Why has all of this happened? Why has God allowed this to come? And the answer is essentially, the answer is Saul suffered God's judgment because of his own failure to obey God. If you have a Bible and you want to flick back a few pages, we come to 1 Samuel chapter 15, where Samuel says to Saul, look, I'm the one the Lord sent to anoint you, Saul, king over Israel. Now listen to the message from the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came out of Egypt. Now that goes back to Exodus 17. As the Israelites were leaving their slavery in Egypt, the Amalekites came and they ambushed them. And there's that story where they have to hold up Moses' hands in prayer for the whole day as Israel fights against the Amalekites, and they just about overcome. But in that passage, God says, because of what they've done, I will blot out the name of the Amalekites. In fact, I'll be at war with them from generation to generation, and the history bears that out. The Amalekites are constantly coming to oppose and attack God's people. And so when the opportunity comes, God says to Saul, go, attack the Amalekites, and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. So Saul goes off, and though he wins the victory, in verse 9 of 1 Samuel 15, we read, Saul and the army spared Agag, and the best of the sheep and the cattle and the fat calves and the lambs and everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely. And then the word of the Lord came to Samuel, I regret that I've made Saul king, because he's turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. And then in the very next chapter, Samuel is sent to anoint David, 1 Samuel 16. And so David finds himself, he's not the king at this point, but he's the anointed king in waiting. And so what happens to Saul and Israel is effectively God's judgment. Because Saul disobeyed, God has judged him, and the consequences are devastating for him, for his children, for the army, and actually for all of Israel. His fall has really taken the people with him. But there is even here a hint of hope. There is a little glimmer of something, because what has David been doing in verse 1? He's returned from striking down the Amalekites. And so you've got this kind of interesting parallel where at the very moment where Saul is dying because of his failure to strike down the Amalekites, David is doing what? He's striking down the Amalekites. So there's this sense, the narrator sort of wants you to think, well, maybe David is the one. Maybe David will be the obedient king who will restore our fortunes and bring God's blessing on us. There's just that hint in the midst of the devastation. Secondly, we move from the desperate situation to a devious invention. A devious invention. On the third day, this is verse 2 of 2 Samuel 1, a man arrived from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dust on his head. That's a sign of mourning, dust being sort of symbolic of humanity. From dust you are, to dust you'll return. He's wearing the clothes of mourning, and he comes to David and he falls on the ground and he pays him honor. And David says, where have you come from? He said, I've escaped from the Israelite camp. What happened? Well, he says, many died. Saul and his son Jonathan are dead. And David says effectively, well, how do you know? And he says, well, I was there. Verse 6, I was on Mount Gilboa. And there was Saul leaning on his spear with the chariots and their drivers in hot pursuit. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me and said, "What can I do?" He asked me, "Who are you?" "An Amalekite," I answered. Then he said to me, "Stand here by me and kill me. I'm in the throes of death, but still alive." So I stood beside him and I killed him. Because I knew after he'd fallen he couldn't survive. I took the crown on his head, the band on his arm. I've brought them here to my Lord. Now, what's happening? There's a couple of holes in this story. One small one and one really big one. The small hole in the man's story, I think, is in verse 6, isn't it? Where he says, "Well, I just happened to be on Mount Gilboa." You think, really? You just sort of happened to be there? I was out for an afternoon stroll, and I had my kind of picnic basket, and I was just looking for a bit of fresh air and some scenic views, and I just found myself in the middle of a battlefield. And I just happened to come across Saul, and nobody was anywhere near him. And so he asked me to do this thing, and I thought I'd put him out of his misery, and so I did. Well, that's the small hole. The big hole actually is in 1 Samuel 31. Again, if you've got a Bible, flick back one page. And here's what we read. Verse 3 of chapter 31, we see the fighting has grown fierce. The archers overtook. They wounded him critically. And Saul said to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me." His armor bearer was terrified and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. And when the armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul, his 3 sons, his armor bearer, and all his men died together that same day. So what's going on? The narrator has told us in chapter 31 that Saul took his own life. And in 2 Samuel chapter 1, this Amalekite says that he did the deeds. Well, what's happening? Boys and girls, you know what's happening, don't you? Let me try and make this as clear as I can for you. Boys and girls, have a look at that. 1 Samuel 31:4, Saul took his own sword and fell on it. 2 Samuel 1:10, I stood beside him and killed him. What is happening, boys and girls? What is the Amalekite doing? What's he telling? He's a liar, isn't he? You can say it with me. Liar, liar, pants on fire. That's what the Amalekite is doing. Now, why does he want to tell this lie? Why does he come? This is an 80-mile journey, a 3-day journey from Mount Gilboa to Ziklag to come and bring this news. Well, I think the clue is just over the page, 2 Samuel 4, when David recounts the incident. Chapter 4, verse 10, and David says this, "So when someone told me Saul is dead and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and put him to death." He thinks he's bringing good news, doesn't he? He thinks he's bringing this good news of Saul's death. Saul, the man who has been pursuing David and trying to kill David, and he thinks they're going to kind of get the champagne out. And the little kind of cocktail sausages on sticks and the little cubes of pineapple and cheese on the sticks and the little mini quiches. And there's going to be, come on, celebrate good times, come on. Saul is dead. Isn't this wonderful news that I bring you? And I did it. Maybe you could make me a member of your new cabinet. Well, that's his ambition. But I think he makes a grave miscalculation, pun intended. Because he forgets this, doesn't he? The Amalekite does not realize that the Lord hates lies. In Psalm 5, verse 6, we read this: "You destroy those who tell lies, the bloodthirsty and deceitful." Proverbs 12:22, "The Lord detests lying lips." Leviticus 19:11, "Do not lie, do not deceive one another." Proverbs 19, verse 9, "Those who pour forth lies will perish." No, God hates lies. God's people must not tell lies. Bob Harris was a much-loved weatherman during the 70s in the United States. He had a decade-long career on some of the biggest TV networks. And in 1969, he got his job. He called up the New York TV company and introduced himself as Dr. Bob Harris, a man with a PhD in geophysics from Columbia University. After a short trial, he was hired, and his star rose, his fame grew. But in 1979, an anonymous letter prompted the TV network he was working for to investigate his claims about his academic credentials. He was found out to have lied about everything. The station fired him. He lost his home. Eventually, his marriage broke down. And he later said, "I knew there wasn't a snowball's chance starting out if you didn't have a degree or some broadcast experience. So I took a shortcut. That turned out to be the long way round. And one day the bill came due. And I'll be sorry as long as I'm alive." In 2014, there was a research study done in the university, at Northwestern University. And the researcher got in touch with a whole number of her colleagues and asked, he said, "Go through your last 30 text messages and tell me whether or not there's anything deceitful in them. Not the content, just whether you have lied in your last 30 text messages." Only 23% could say that there was no deceit in any of their last 30 text messages. That means 77%, more than 3/4, had in their most recent communications told lies. Most of them were sort of everyday lies, little things, white lies. But as one writer has said, those who think it permissible to tell a white lie pretty soon become colorblind. Now, we must not tell lies. Integrity in speech is a critical part of our worship and our witness. We will face that inward temptation and sometimes the external pressure, but we must resist it, mustn't we? We must resist the temptation to embellish your CV or tell that white lie, to get a contract, to gain a promotion, to protect the company or a colleague. The lies which save face and protect our reputation, maybe fiddling the numbers on our tax return or our expenses claim. Now, we must resist that pressure. We must resist it. We must not lie. We must be people of integrity. It is how, isn't it? It's how we obey and honor God and bear witness to others through the integrity of our speech. It is a pressure, isn't it? I texted a few friends this week and said, "Oh, have you ever felt that pressure?" One person came back to me and said, "To be honest, at one job I was at, I struggled to remember a day when I wasn't pressured to lie." That pressure's there, isn't it? We must resist it. The third thing that we see here is a decisive intervention. As we go down to verse 11, we see David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan and for the army of the Lord and for the nation of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. Now, the narrator could have just moved straight from the lie to sort of the execution of judgment. But he doesn't, does he? The narrator gives us, verse 11 and 12, this little moment of mourning. Now, we'll return to it next week because the second half of chapter 1 has a much longer lament. But it is just worth noting, isn't it? Even though Saul has pursued David and sought his life, David will still not rejoice in his death. David still has this reverence for God's anointed. David has constantly refused to take matters into his own hands. And even though Saul has done wicked and is under the judgment of God, the thing considered in itself is his death is still sad. David does not delight in the death of the wicked because God does not delight in the death of the wicked, as we see in Ezekiel 18 and chapter 33. They fast and they weep for the rest of the day, not just for Saul, but also for Jonathan, for the army, for the nation. He mourns for the people. I wonder at what point the Amalekite thought, this isn't going as I expected. As he brings the news, and then all of David's men just go into deep mourning. And he's there, he's thinking, there's no little party poppers. There's no cake. There's none of those little kind of gold cone-shaped hats with a little bits of elastic underneath. Maybe this isn't going to turn out so well. And sure enough, David turns to the young man and says, where are you from? He says, I'm the son of a foreigner and Amalekites. Well, that's a bit of an alarm bell in itself, isn't it? And David asked him, why weren't you afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? And David called one of his men and said, strike him down. So he struck him down and he died. For David had said to him, your blood be on your own heads. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, I killed the Lord's anointed. Now you might be thinking at this point, well, that seems a tad excessive, doesn't it? I mean, he didn't actually kill him. He lied about it, sure, but is David justified in sort of taking matters into his own hands and executing such a severe punishment on him? Well, I think in a sense you say the punishment does fit the crime, as we've seen elsewhere in Psalm 5 and Proverbs 9. Those who pour out lies will perish. The Lord destroys those who lie. But I think there's something else happening here. Because I think as you look at this incident is a type of a much bigger thing, of a much more serious thing, actually. So in this incident, what's happening is we have this Amalekite, this member of this group of people who oppose God. They oppose God's people. They oppose God's purposes. They seek to thwart God's promises. And God, through his anointed king, executes judgment on him. God, through his anointed Messiah, his anointed Christ, executes judgment on those that would stand against God and his people. And so as you trace the Bible story through, you see, look, God always fights for his people. And actually the Bible tells us that there will come a day when the true and better king, the eternal anointed king, God the Son, Jesus, the perfect king, there will come a day when he will execute God's judgments. There will come a day when he will return and he will bring God's righteous and just judgment on all of those, not just Amalekites, but on all of those who have stood opposed to God, have opposed God's people, have opposed God's purposes, have opposed his promises. It's actually a much more serious thing, isn't it? This is a picture of something much more kind of real. For us to say, if we're not right with God yet, if we've not come to God yet, if we've not bowed the knee to the Lord Jesus King and asked for his forgiveness, then we need to come, don't we? We must come and ask Jesus for his forgiveness before it's too late, before we face him as that perfect and righteous judge. Before the judgment isn't simply temporal, but it's eternal. Well, how do we escape it? How do we escape it? If God is just and if those who pour out lies perish, how do we possibly escape? I think the answer is in the passage, and I want to try and show you something here. I think we could look at this as we could see sort of three crowns in this passage. or three sorts of crown in the passage. 3 times in here, there's reference to something being upon the head. So the first one comes as the Amalekite comes and he's got the dust on his head, that sign of the frailty of humanity. The second crown is the one he steals from the Lord's anointed. It's not his, but he takes it. The third crown is the blood that is on his own head in verse 16 for his own judgment, as God's anointed pronounces judgment on him. He wears these 3 crowns. And as Jesus comes, I think he wears the same 3 crowns. He wears the crown of dust, the crown of frail humanity. He takes the crown of God's anointed king that actually does belong to him. And remarkably, as he goes to the cross, he doesn't say your blood be on your own heads. He says your blood be on my head. Your blood can be on my head. As he goes to the cross, as he bears the punishment that we all deserve for our lies and everything and the rest, as he's doing that, he's saying, here's a way where the justice of God can be satisfied and the mercy of God displayed. Your blood can be on my head if you will come. If you will come and ask. If we'll come and make Jesus our King and our Saviour. We find him not opposed to us, but our friend. And we can do that easily, can't we? You can do that sat right in your chair this morning. You can, in your heart, just cry out to God and say, God, for too long I've kept you away. And I want you to be my King. And I want to follow you. Please, will you forgive me? And he promises he will. John chapter 6, we read, all who come, Jesus says, I will never drive away. Anyone who comes to him this morning, sat right where you are, can find yourself a forgiven friend forever of Jesus. So I hope you can see as we kind of step into 2 Samuel, what initially looks a little bit old and dusty and boring, a bit like those old churches my dad used to take us round. I hope you can see there's, if we look a bit closer, if we work hard, there is real treasure, real good gospel news in here. Despite the deceivers, despite the opponents, the crown still finds its way in God's powerful provision and his persevering protection of his people, even in the most unlikely and unpromising of circumstances. God is at work as his message goes out through the generations and from Jesus to the world. It's good news. It's encouraging to us, isn't it? In the midst of our own circumstances, our own situations, whatever they look like, however confusing they feel, to know that God is still at work. He is still looking after his people. He is still drawing us ever nearer to the day when we bow our knee before the King. To quote the words of our final song, though I may not see what the future brings, I will watch and wait for the Saviour King. Then my joy complete, standing face to face in the presence of the Ancient of Days.